experience of the resurgence of India was as a student in Madras. In those days, Madras used to be called the benighted presidency, hardly a term which is applicable to Kamaraj Nadar's Madras. It was called the benighted presidency because the political awakening which had occurred in other parts of India had not touched Madras. The person who woke up Madras from this torpor was an Englishwoman, Mrs. Annie Besant. She was a great favorite of ours, a great favorite of the students of Madras. Wherever she spoke, we turned up in large numbers. And she was a wonderful orator. Her method was simple. She would speak of India's golden past, when India was the center of civilization, at a time when in Europe the Franks and the Angles and the Saxons and the Vikings and the Slavs, barbarian tribes, were fighting with one another. And then she would speak of the present condition of India: poor, illiterate, diseased, superstitious. And she would argue that the only remedy was for Indians to take the country's destiny into their own hands. The manner of her speaking was as remarkable as the matter. She would begin quietly with her hands folded in front. Gradually, she would warm up. Then her hair, which had been smoothly combed, would stand like quills upon the fretful porpentine, and she would look like a being possessed. But before long, certain unsavory incidents in the Theosophical Society, of which she was the head, tarnished her luster. It was at this time that Mahatma Gandhi appeared on the Indian scene. I still remember our first glimpse of him, one of the first glimpses the people of India had of him. He addressed a meeting in my own college in Madras. It was different from any other meeting that I had attended. All other meetings used to be held in some hall like the YMHA or the YMIA. This was held in the open courtyard. Not a doorway, not a window in the surrounding buildings was empty. Students hung even from the branches of trees, because Gandhiji's reputation had preceded him as a man who had pitched himself body and soul against the wicked government of South Africa. He was simply and elegantly dressed. He had a long white coat and a turban. He had not yet taken to the dress or the undress of the Indian villager. He spoke exactly for an hour. His speech, too, was different from any other speech that I had heard. There were no flashes of eloquence, no frills of oratory, no barbs of satire. His speech simply flowed like the Rani in Garsapa Falls. Those of you who come from the south must have visited the magnificent Garsapa Falls on the border of Mysore and Bombay.
Not now, sir.
Not now? Where is it now?
It's all in my Mysore.
All in Mysore. I see. I see that I am behind the times. Well, these falls consist of 4 distinct falls: the Raja, the Rani, the Rocket, and the Aurora. The Raja flows copiously, voluminously, majestically, and a little pompously. The Rani flows simply and quietly, but purposefully. The roarer comes out of a crevice, making a huge noise, and the rocket flows in a series of jets. I have heard many speakers, especially South Indian speakers, who could be compared to the roarer or the rocket. And a speaker like Surendranath Banerjee, he could only be compared to the Raja. But Gandhiji's speech reminded one of the Rani. It was a simple effusion of truth and therefore of beauty. We did not realize at that time what a portent his appearance was on the Indian political scene. Hitherto, even the vision of Mrs. Annie Besant had not penetrated beyond home rule or responsible government. But here was a navigator, an adventurous navigator, who would take India beyond the straits of home rule, beyond the gulf of dominion status into the swelling sea of independence. I would also like to mention another incident, which showed how different the attitude of the Congress used to be before Gandhiji appeared. Before the appearance of Mahatma Gandhi, the Congress used to be a suppliant for independence, for home rule. Now it demanded freedom. In 1916, when I was a student in Madras, the annual session of the Indian National Congress was held in Madras. At that time, I became a volunteer of the Congress by paying 10 rupees, a princely sum for me in those days, and in these days too, after my retirement. Well, we were sitting in the hall when there began a clapping. The clapping became louder and louder, and I too joined the clapping, not knowing what it was all about. And then people started standing up, and I too stood up, not knowing what I was standing up for. I looked behind, and I saw a tall man, thin as a wraith, walking with great dignity with two ADCs in front. It was none other than Lord Penland, the governor of Madras. This was the first time that a provincial governor had condescended to attend a session of the seditionist Indian National Congress. The president of the Congress received him not merely with courtesy, but with deference, and offered him a seat to his right. Some speaker who had been holding forth on the rigors of the Indian Arms Act was asked to stop, and Surendranath Banerjee, the arch orator of the Congress, was asked to move a resolution on loyalty to the King Emperor. That showed how loyal or loyalist the Indian National Congress used to be in those days. But it showed not merely the character of the Congress at that time, it also showed the predicament of the British government. In the 19th century, the British government had sent our armies hither and thither to all the troubled spots of Asia and Africa, to Egypt, to Iran, to Malaya, to Hong Kong, without the slightest pretext of consulting public opinion. But now, already, public opinion was beginning to be a factor to reckon with. Great Britain needed India's support in the First World War. And in order to gain her support, she had to appeal for the sympathy of the people. By and large, the people were uninterested in the war, in spite of demonstrations of loyalty by the princess and others. Many people even wanted Germany to win, because nothing they thought could be worse than the imperialism which they were experiencing. Others preferred the British to win on the principle that the devil one knows is better than the devil one doesn't know. But by and large, the attitude of the people was a plague on both your houses. But Britain, as I said, wanted the support of India. And therefore, she had to present the war not as a European civil war, as Sardar Panikar has called it, not as a European civil war, but as a war for freedom, a war for democracy. And that inevitably raised the question, well, if it is a war for freedom, what about the freedom of India? If it is a war for democracy, what about the democracy of India? And so in 1917, Great Britain made that historic but carefully hedged declaration saying that the goal of British policy in India was the gradual development of self-governing institutions with a view to the progressive realization of responsible government in India as an integral part of the British Empire. But even before this, Great Britain began to feel the need of responding to public opinion. If there is one event which could be said to mark the zenith of British rule in India, that was the imperial durbar of King George V in 1911. At that time, two notable gestures of appeasement were made. One was the annulment of the partition of Bengal. Lord Curzon had partitioned Bengal ostensibly on administrative grounds, but in reality it was regarded as a blatant attempt to divide and rule. And public opinion was enraged at this act. This infamous deed was now annulled. Another imaginative act which was done at that time was the transfer of the capital from Calcutta to Delhi. Calcutta is an upstart city. It has no traditions. It did not even exist before the British came into India. It's purely a British product. And in Calcutta, the government was unduly susceptible to British commercial opinion. Delhi, on the other hand, was historically sacred, historically dear both to Hindus and Muslims. And therefore, the transfer of the capital was regarded as a very gracious gesture. Of course, there was a furious debate in Parliament in which this transfer was severely denounced, particularly by Lord Curzon, who felt that he was personally affronted because the government house in Calcutta was built after the model of his own ancestral home. And he ended his tirade against the government for this transfer with the words, 7 Delhis have risen and fallen, this is the 8th. 36 years later, his prophecy came true, and the 8th Delhi passed away quietly into history. At this time, there came into the political vocabulary of the world a new word, a new and potent word, self-determination. It was coined by a high-minded and idealistic president of America, President Wilson. He coined it primarily with an eye to Europe. In Europe, the Habsburg empire was crumbling, and the various nationalities, the Hungarians, the Romanians, the Bulgarians, the Yugoslavs, and others, they wanted to have national states of their own. So the word self-determination was primarily coined with an eye to Europe, but Asia could not be excluded from its scope, and it began to have a potency, almost as great a potency as the words liberty, equality, and fraternity a century previously. It was also at this time that there occurred in Russia the Great Revolution. It affected different countries in Asia differently. Many peoples were repelled by the unimaginable cruelty in which the revolutionaries as well as the counter-revolutionaries indulged. But what impressed people was the external aspects of the revolution. To start with, it looked as if the Soviet Union had broken with the policy of the Tsars. The Soviet Union gave independence to Finland. It also annulled the partition of Poland, one of the most unholy transactions in European history was the way in which Poland was partitioned by Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Catherine the Great had joined Frederick the Great of Prussia and Maria Theresa of Austria. Catherine the Great had joined them, even though the last king of Poland was King Poniatowski, was a lover of hers, one of her numerous lovers, and perhaps that accounts for it. But whatever that may be, Poland now became independent. Towards Asia, a number of friendly gestures were made. The Soviet Union gave up the extraterritorial rights which she had acquired together with the Western countries in the 19th century. The Western powers, on the other hand, they dug their toes in. They appointed a commission with, of all people, a South African at its head, Justice Feetham, to go into the question of extraterritorial rights. And as you might expect from a South African, a report was produced, a monumental justification of the continuance of the extraterritorial rights in China. Not only that, the Soviet Union recognized the government, the revolutionary government of Sun Yat-sen. The Western powers were apathetic, if not hostile, to it. They supported the man, the strong man who had betrayed the revolution, Yuan Shikai, and gave him a huge loan. Even after he died, they hesitated to support the government of Sun Yat-sen. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, openly supported the government of Sun Yat-sen and sent them military and political advisors, including our own M.N. Roy. A few years later, the revolution in China took a sharp turn to the right. The Kuomintang became a party in the hands of the reactionary elements in society. It expelled the Russian advisors, military and political, and in this way, a revolution came over China. But these developments lie outside the scope of my lecture. Well, so these factors, the First World War, the advent of Mahatma Gandhi on the Indian political scene, the doctrine of self-determination, the October Revolution, all these created a new temper in Asia. And the British tried to adapt their policies to the changing temper in Asia. Hence their declaration that the goal of British policy was the gradual development of self-governing institutions with a view to the progressive realization of responsible government in India as an integral part of the British Empire. It was carefully hedged, but the Congress didn't recognize the hedges. They wanted to jump straight into the heart of independence. The British recognized more than any other imperialist power would have done. The British recognized the greatness of Mahatma Gandhi, his sincerity, his hold on the masses. At the same time, they claimed it to be their right to regulate the pace of independence in India, the pace of the movement of independence in India. When the pace became too hot, they tried to hold India back. They often made concessions which to them seemed substantial, but which to the Congress seemed trivial. And when the Congress spurned these concessions, they arrested our leaders and imprisoned them. They tried to set up rival leaders, sometimes men of ability, but often men of straw, politically men of straw, because they had no standing in the country. They encouraged the reactionary elements in society. They devised a new theory that the relations of the princess was not with the government of India at all, but with the crown. They developed a sudden affection for the so-called untouchables and tried to set them up as a separate political entity, and gave it up only when Gandhiji fought it with his own life. Above all, consciously or unconsciously, they fostered the two-nation theory which led to the partition of India. But with all that, the British knew instinctively that the only man who could deliver the goods was Gandhiji, that the only the institution which could deliver the goods was the Congress. And Gandhiji was always ready to talk with the government so long as there was any possibility of having useful talks. Thus, non-cooperation itself proceeded sometimes in fitful cooperation with the government until India moved into independence at midnight in 1947. This, I think, is a convenient point for me to stop. I hope you will forgive me for having indulged in the reminiscences of my official and student days. That is the surest sign of a man in retirement. But I hope you will not think that these incidents, these references have been altogether irrelevant to the subject of the relevance of India in a historic period, historic not merely for our country but for Asia and the world.